We're back with Jason Johnson and Joyce Vance. Joyce, your thoughts on these clashes and how the courts will have to make some decisions here in questions that really do go to whether or not there are king-like powers.
We're so early in this decision tree, Ari. I think it's important to say right now we're looking in the Ninth Circuit today at whether the president can nationalize a state's National Guard and bring them in. Of course, that doesn't begin to look at the question of whether the president can legitimately use Marines on American soil, or does that violate our prohibition against using the military for domestic law enforcement. And the upcoming confrontation involves the Supreme Court, which has been very willing to entertain this notion of a sort of maximalist president with enormous powers that we have not traditionally ascribed to an American president, powers that people might say are king-like in many ways. That, I think, is the larger environment in which we're viewing all of these events, and it's important to keep them in context.
Jason? All the above, not just the case.
This whole case really relies upon the president's ability to convince a judge or convince the regular American people that Los Angeles was a mess. And they wanted to make it look like the protests were the No Church in the Wild video. There was just everything being destroyed. And I've said in many times that that's not the case. I was in Los Angeles. The majority of the protests were downtown. It was a very constrained area one way or another. So on the facts of the case, there was no emergency. There was no chaos. There was no invasion.
You're making a serious point with a lighthearted reference. I think a lot of cars were destroyed in that video, that music video, but go on.
Yes. This is true. This is true. And only 3 Waymo cars were actually destroyed in downtown Los Angeles. But I think the other important thing to remember here is that all that Trump is doing is trying to set a precedent for how he'll operate in other cities, right? Gavin Newsom is going to stand up to him. California has a lot of power economically and politically that Trump can't penetrate at this point. But will the same thing happen in Texas? Probably not with Abbott. Will the same sort of thing happen in Atlanta, Georgia? Probably not with Kemp. So my concern is whether or not the president is successful in taking control of the National Guard in the state of California. He's still using this as a guidepost for what he wants to do in states where the governors may not be as strong or more likely to resist.
And Jason, on the political side, slightly more for you than Joyce, although I'm interested in Joyce's views on, I'd say, just about everything. When you look at this, where I said, is Mike Lee to the right of MAGA fringe conspiracy, or is he to the bottom, or is he subterranean when it comes to basic decency? What does it tell you that on the one hand he deleted, so he wanted attention, he got more than his share, but he still hasn't addressed this as any decent person would?
Well, this is the thing, Ari. Mike Lee is a coward. I mean, I'm just going to say that. You are a coward. If you're going to say something like that, then you need to either stand 10 toes down and explain why you said it, or actually make a public apology. And what he confronted, which you mentioned before about trolls and bullies, when Congressman Smith actually went up to him, he was dealing with the say it to my face energy that many of these Republican trolls don't face, right? Someone actually saying, okay, go ahead, say that to me while we're all in mourning. And he couldn't do it. And I think that was an important step on her behalf, but it's also a reflection of the lack of conviction that he has in anything he says. He's used to just being able to throw rocks and hide his hand, and this time he couldn't. But there's too many Republicans who operate that way and are able to hide because they're not confronted.
Well, Jason, some people say, what you refer to, say it to my face, some people say, do it again. You know, do it again. Come up here and do it right now. Right, exactly. Pull up then, right? And he's not that person. And I would love to think that he will have learned his lesson from this, but I don't think so. And if it's not him, it's Jim Jordan. If it's not him, it's Marjorie Taylor Greene. It has been an attitude of the Republican Party for a good 15 years now to just sort of say these things, hide when confronted, right? And then find an opportunity to say it again and hide in the right-wing echo chamber. Joyce, your thoughts both on that sad part of the story, if you want, but also, given your background prosecuting tough cases, on where we are on this political violence. Each case is distinct, and it takes time to deal with a suspect, a defendant now, and go through more evidence and motive. And yet, as the Times put it,
We are in a place now where this type of political violence, not always, thank God, completely lethal and successful, is becoming, quote, almost routine.
You know, not so long ago, there were 2 efforts to assassinate a political candidate, Donald Trump. And that was perhaps a moment where the parties had more unity than we had seen in a long time. Both sides of the aisle, people condemned political violence. That's what we have to always do when political violence happens in this country. Everyone of good faith should be condemning it. It doesn't matter who the perpetrator is. It doesn't matter who the victim is. If you are committed to a constitutional system of justice, a country that's a full-blown democracy, then there's simply no room to tolerate political violence. And so maybe the one political thing I'll say, Ari, about Senator Lee is he had such an opportunity here, an opportunity to stand up and be the grown-up in the room and say, I got carried away. Sometimes we all do that on social media, but I was wrong. I apologize to my friend, Senator Smith. You know, I honor the legacy of these politicians in Minnesota, and he simply couldn't do it. That is very much the mood that Donald Trump has imposed on the Republican Party, and they have to break free from that.
Yeah, both you make an important points. I appreciate that. Joyce, Vance, Jason Johnson, our thanks.